And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Coach Gene Clemens here. I am here with Sam Herder. He is lead analyst for Hero Sports, covers everything FCS, also does great writing for BetMGM and has his own podcast. Sam, thank you for joining me. Tell us about the podcast real quick.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on. Always good to talk some FCS, and my podcast is appropriately called FCS Football Talk, where I just kind of go in there and hit record and talk for about 45 minutes about FCS storylines. And so I've been enjoying doing that, and I appreciate you having me on again.
Absolutely. And I know that you are passionate about the FCS. Anybody who's ever followed you knows that you're passionate about the FCS. You're constantly tweeting about it. You're in the know. You're on the scene a lot of times, as people could see if they were looking in the background to all of the passes behind. You're on the scene a lot. Just tell us, how 1 to 10, how crazy was this past weekend in the FCS?
Ooh, probably like maybe a 7 or an 8, somewhere around there. There's been crazier. I think in the spring there was 1 week, maybe it was like a week 5, week 6, where like 4 teams in the top 10 all lost and 4 of the top 6 ranked teams lost. So there's been some crazy weekends, but this one just really threw things in a loop, especially with South Dakota State losing and James Madison losing as well. Those were kind of the top teams for a lot of people. And not only did they lose, but they lost to like other really good teams, Southern Illinois and Villanova. And so that kind of shuffled things around quite a bit compared to when, like in the past, like if a North Dakota State lost a random game to like South Dakota, wouldn't really move things around a whole lot just because South Dakota was still like maybe not a ranked team at the time. So it was just these over-ranked wins really throw things into a loop.
Well, and that's an interesting thing, and we'll talk about that more when we get into our top 8. But I think the interesting part about it is that when you get a ranked team beating another ranked team, it brings into question, okay, is that just a good team losing to a good team? And if we replayed that again, could there be a different result, or was there something exposed in that game that maybe hadn't been exposed because the level of competition they were playing wasn't up to the level of the team that they just played? Because that's what we're talking about when we get to the playoffs. We're saying, how are you going to do against those type of teams? Not necessarily how you're going to do against, no offense, but like Holy Cross.
Right, exactly. And that's the big thing with these wins, because, based off of regionalization of the playoff bracket, James Madison, Villanova, they could see each other again. South Dakota State, Southern Illinois, they could see each other again. And so it's one of those things where I think James Madison and South Dakota State feel like they probably should have won that game. If James Madison makes a couple of easy field goals, they probably win. South Dakota State doesn't make some mental lapses. They, convert on that 2-point conversion at the end. They win that game. And that's kind of the difference between, now they're the number 7 and 8 teams in the country compared to if they did pull off those close wins, maybe they're 1 and 2 or 2 and 3. And so things are just so razor thin right now, which makes it interesting to talk about, these seeds and what we think is going to happen, just because, week to week it could change, which makes it really fun.
Well, awesome. And I agree. I think that's really more the more fun for me, as we talked about off air. I really more enjoy looking at where we're going to be when we hit the playoffs and what these teams are playing for. And I've heard you talk in the past about style points. And I push back slightly, because I feel like sometimes style points can be overblown when you're talking about a bad team. Like, a lot of people will give Eastern Washington or take points away from Eastern Washington because they give up so many points. Well, it didn't look good because they gave up such and such points versus this team. But then at the same time, not take style points away from maybe a Montana who holds a team to like 6 points, but only scores like 21 or 24 instead. And to me, it's almost the same thing. I don't really particularly care. To me, a 24-point win is a 24-point win. So when we were talking about style, and you're talking specifically about beating ranked teams, is it just about getting the win, or does it really matter at that point when you're playing another ranked team? Does it really matter about how you win?
I think when it's ranked versus ranked, style points don't necessarily matter. Whether if you blow out, another really highly ranked team, that's obviously a really good style, point win. But I mean, Southern Illinois beating South Dakota State by 1 point or by 16 points, okay, that maybe might be the same thing as far as their resume. But when I talk about style points, I'm mostly pointing at Sam Houston because the Bearcats are probably going to go undefeated, but they're only going to have 2 ranked wins probably on their resume. And so what's the best way for them to prove to the playoff committee that they are deserving of a top 2 seed over maybe Eastern Washington or North Dakota State that have 4 ranked wins? How do they do that? They have style wins. If they beat a team like Abilene Christian by 7 points, that kind of makes you go, that's, a win is a win, but Abilene Christian is okay. That's not really convincing me that Sam Houston is a top 2 seed. But if they, beat these inferior teams by like 45-7 or just blowing them out, that kind of makes you go, okay, they can't help that their conference doesn't have a lot of ranked teams, but they're doing what they're supposed to do. They're blowing these teams out. Maybe then they get the benefit of the doubt over teams that have more ranked wins. And so I'm more so pointing to a team like Sam Houston that has a really good team, I think, a really, really good team, but their strength of schedule isn't that great. And so they need, those kind of sexy wins and blowout wins.
Absolutely. I do, however, think it is impressive that they've continued to win without one of the best quarterbacks in the nation. I think that says a lot about their team as a whole, about their depth. We saw the difference in South Dakota State without their starting quarterback. They're like having to rely essentially only on the running backs being able to make plays. And now with another like good quarterback in place, they're back to being a championship contender. I don't want to hold you off too long. I really want to get into this top 8. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the top 8. As you all know, top 8 seeds in the FCS, they all receive a bye. And so we wanted to look at the top 8 and kind of rank them in order from 8 to 1 of the 8 teams that we believe are going to get the bye. So, Sam, who is your number 8 team at the end of the year? Who will be sitting at number 8?
Yeah, right now I have Montana is my 8 seed. They have, obviously the one loss right now to Eastern Washington, but they have a good Power 5 win against Washington. Montana should run the table up until the brawl of the Wild game. If they do beat Montana State at the end, I think they can rise a lot higher than the number 8 seed, just depending on what happens elsewhere. But I have them number 8 right now. Just because it's a bit projective in my bracketology, and I'm not sure yet if they'll beat Montana State. I think that's a 50-50 game. And so that's right. That's why right now I have them at number 8. But certainly if they win out, will most likely be higher than number 8.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I actually think for my number 8, I actually agree with you. I think Montana will drop down to number 8. I think it was if we're talking about impressive victories, the Eastern Washington victory over Montana was definitely worth style points and what they were able to put together versus Montana, especially in the second half, I thought was really impressive. But it was also telling for me to go, okay, it takes an Eastern Washington level offense to be able to put points up on that Montana defense. I don't know if Montana State has the ability to do what Eastern Washington does. I think if you're asking me right now, I give them I give Montana the edge over Montana State in that game. But I think that they'll probably end up somewhere around here, 8, maybe 7 or 6, depending upon what happens in front of them. But I like Montana at number 8 right now. Who's your number 17?
Yeah, so right now I have South Dakota State as my 7 team, is my 7 seed. Again, South Dakota State, if they win out, they could honestly jump to a top 3 seed, maybe even a top 2 seed if SIU loses a game, because South Dakota State, the Jacks have a few ranked games upcoming, all at home, the big one coming against North Dakota State. And so if the Jacks kind of get past this loss to Southern Illinois, they win out, they'll have like 3 to 4 ranked wins, an FBS win, a really good win against North Dakota State. They could rise all the way up to number 3 seed. I have them 7 right now, kind of the same reason as Montana. I'm not sure if they do win out. I'm not 50-50 game against North Dakota State. And so I'm not going to sit here right now and say, yep, South Dakota State is going to be a top 4 seed. That's kind of what I have them back a little ways in my seeding.
And it's actually interesting. I had as my number 7 team, I actually had Southern Illinois. And I think for me, I see them losing again. I think that they caught a South Dakota State team that just for whatever reason was vulnerable. We know they're not at full strength. None of these teams that played deep into the postseason in the spring seem to be have the greatest health right now. It's not surprising. I do think that South Dakota State rights the ship. They hold all of the keys to their future, I believe. Southern Illinois, I could see them having another slip up. I don't think they are as sound defensively as some of the other top teams are outside of Eastern Washington. And so I think that they'll finish high, but I think that they'll probably finish back behind one or two of those teams in the Missouri Valley Football Conference. Who's your number 6 right now?
Yeah, so for number 6, I have James Madison. They obviously losing to Villanova hurts, and they're going to have to hope Villanova maybe loses again. And then because I do think James Madison has a really, really good chance to win out. And then a 10-1 James Madison team potentially could get into the top 4 seeds again. Just depending what happens elsewhere, but. By the time they play Delaware, I'm not sure if Delaware will still be ranked. Weber State was a ranked win, but I don't know if Weber State is going to make the playoffs this year. They're kind of that fringe bubble team. New Hampshire was a ranked win, but we'll see if New Hampshire is ranked by the end of the season. And so resume-wise, I don't know if James Madison is going to have an absolutely tremendous resume at the end of the season, even if it is a 10-1 overall record. And so that's why I have them number 6 right now, because I do think they'll finish 10-1, but I think their chance at a top 4 seed, top 2 seed definitely basically went out the window with that loss to Villanova.
And I'm inclined to believe the same thing. I've got James Madison at number 6, and my reason really is, if anybody's followed me, I haven't really been sold on James Madison as a top 4 tier team all season. Now, I don't think that the loss to Villanova is an awful loss, but I also don't think Villanova is winning the national championship. And so when you look at the CAA and what they bring to the table, yes, it's a competitive conference. Is it the Missouri Valley Football Conference? Absolutely not. Is it the Big Sky? Absolutely not. And so if it's not the Big Sky and if it's not the Missouri Valley, then what are we saying? So I think they're going to get hit in that situation. I think a team like Sam Houston could find itself in that kind of situation if they were to lose a game where they drop all the way from a top tier team down to a second tier team. And I just think that's what we're talking about with James Madison. I think they have to get more consistent quarterback play. Special teams have definitely got to do their job, but you also could just score touchdowns, and that would solve a lot of the issues with having to settle for field goals if you're able to put the ball in the end zone. And so I think for a team like James Madison, it'll not only matter about them winning, but it'll matter how they win. From here on out, unimpressive victories in conference are not going to help them stake their claim for what I believe will be some really hotly contested top 8 seeds. But right now, I think if I had to project out, I think they have a chance to continue to win, control their own destiny, and land in that top 8 somewhere. This is the most logical space for me. Number five, who do you have?
I have Southern Illinois at number 5. They have a tough 3 games coming up next, and they can't afford, an emotional letdown after an emotional win at South Dakota State. They're playing a UND team that is basically fighting for its playoff lives right now. They have a bye, then they go to Northern Iowa, and Northern Iowa is a really tough team, tough place to play. Then after that, it's a home game versus Missouri State, which I think is going to be like a shootout kind of crazy game with a crazy finish. And by that point, Missouri State might be playing for its playoff life, where they might need to win that game to make the playoffs. And so Southern Illinois, I can see them possibly dropping a game at some point in the next 3 games. Just kind of they'll be favored to win those games, but maybe they just have that letdown performance. But even if they do lose, they would have 2 losses overall. One comes against Kansas State, which is basically thrown out the window, and then that a 1-loss Southern Illinois team with that win over South Dakota State should be good enough for a top 5 seed.
Absolutely, and I agree that they have a really difficult ending. They're gonna have teams that are going to be on par with them as far as being able to score, and I think that's where you find a lot of the parity that's going on, especially at the upper mid of the Missouri Valley Conference football conference. Excuse me, is that up there you see a lot of teams that could switch and change. For me, right here, number 5, South Dakota State. I think that's where South Dakota State will eventually fall. I don't believe, or eventually end up. I don't know if they're going to be able to do to North Dakota State what they were able to do to North Dakota State last year. I think North Dakota State has competent quarterback play this year. That's going to allow them to be able to get over the hump. I think South Dakota State probably ends up in that 5 range, because they do have one of the most what I think is the most complete team in the FCS when they're doing everything properly. So South Dakota State for me is my number 5. It'll be interesting though. That offense really is geared when you've got multiple backs to give the ball to. Not having the same caliber of multiple backs to give the ball to is definitely hurting that offense. From what I've seen, you just don't have the explosion that they were able to just continually hit you with play after play after play, because they had a fresh, legitimately good running back to put into the fold. And I don't know if that's going to. I don't know if there's any answer coming for that here in the near future. So it may be more on Chris Oladikan going forward to try to really propel this offense and keep them on the field more than they were able to stay on the field versus Southern Illinois. Who's your number 4? We're getting into the top 4 now. These are to me, if you're in the top 4, you have a legitimate opportunity to win a national title. So who's your number 4 team?
Yeah, my projected 4 seed is Villanova right now. Kind of the same thing what we talked about with Southern Illinois. They will be favored to win the remaining of their games. It's just a matter of having that one letdown performance. Resume wise, beating James Madison is a huge resume booster. They do have another ranked win against Richmond at the time of the game, but Richmond is no longer ranked. And so I think I put more factor in that, wins against teams that are currently ranked instead of ranked at the time. But they'll have, Rhode Island is in a couple of weeks. That should be a really good ranked game. Villanova gets them at home. And then the end the regular season, it's at Delaware. By that point, we'll see if Delaware is still ranked without their standout quarterback, Nolan Henderson. Delaware is kind of, they're just not explosive offensively without him. So we'll see if Delaware maybe drops a game here or there and drops out of the top 25. But Nova has a really favorable schedule right now. And if they run the table, they're 10-1, 10-0 against the FCS. Have that huge win against James Madison. I don't know if they would jump a Sam Houston or especially not in Eastern Washington, or maybe not even, undefeated North Dakota State team, just because they might not have the amount of ranked wins. But I do think that win against James Madison will carry a lot of weight and get them a top 4 seed if they do win out.
Yeah, and, here's the thing. I only have Villanova as the number 4 team because I don't see them losing again. Mm-hmm. So I think that the way this works out is an undefeated CAA team will get a top 4 bid, because if James Madison was undefeated, they would get a top 4 bid. So, just going off of that logic, if you're going to give James Madison a top 4 seed, if they would have ran the table, then the team that beat them, you kind of have to give them a top 4 seed. I think that was the case. That's kind of the case in Delaware. With what they're able to do. if they were able to run the table, which I don't see that happening now, but if they were able to run the table, they would have probably had that spot. So I think that Villanova is able to get into there, but I think they are the most vulnerable 4 seed in the bracket for sure. I would probably pick whomever the seed is that they play as a possible upset for Villanova, because I think that they are the most vulnerable 4 seed of any of the top 4. But they're here because there's nowhere else for them to go. Like, if they win out and they're undefeated, they're going to be a top 4 seed. And if they're not, then the selection committee are going to have a lot of questions to answer about how you don't put an undefeated Villanova as a top 4 seed over another team that has a loss, that is in a conference that they probably didn't win. So I think from that standpoint, they control their own destiny to be a top 4 seed. Who's your number 3 seed?
I have the Bison right now of North Dakota State as my 3 seed. NDSU is interesting because they can go anywhere from, frankly, they could get the 1 seed if they win out and let's say Eastern Washington loses. But if Eastern Washington wins out and let's say North Dakota State wins out, I think NDSU would have the resume to be the 2 seed over Sam Houston, just because they'll have basically, I think, probably twice as many ranked wins. The reason I have NDSU number 2 right now is because there's that 50-50 game against South Dakota State where I'm not jumping North Dakota State just yet to a top 2 seed. I just want to wait and see what happens with that South Dakota State game. It'll be interesting too, because NDSU, like I said, maybe they can get the 1 seed if things shake out their way, but they could also maybe drop to the 6 or 7 seed. I mean, if they lose to South Dakota State, let's say South Dakota State wins out, let's say Southern Illinois wins out, North Dakota State only loses the 1 game to South Dakota State. Well, as far as where you rank Valley teams, you would rank Southern Illinois, somewhere, 2-3 seed. You would have to then rank South Dakota State as a seed ahead of North Dakota State, and a 10-1 NDSU team would still be seeded, but they would be seated behind Southern Illinois and South Dakota State. And so the Bison can be anywhere from 1 to the 7 seed, just depending on how things shake out. But I kind of put them a little bit closer to a top 2 seed with putting them number 3.
So I think we're both hinting at the fact you're going to probably see 3 Valley teams in the top 8. They're clearly the class of the FCS again, as far as an entire conference. I don't have North Dakota State here though. And the reason I don't have North Dakota State here is because I am really legitimately worried about quarterback play. And Sam Houston, for as much as I love the Bearcats, and as much as I think that they have one of the most explosive teams offensively and defensively in the country, I can't get by the fact that they don't look like the same team without Schmidt in there. And if you're not going to have a guy who was one of the front runners for the Walter Payton Award in the game, it's hard for me to project you to be out into a top 2 seed or a top 1 seed. I think if Schmidt's there, I have to put the reigning champions as a 1 or 2 seed just out of respect. But with no Schmidt, I've got to be honest and say, I don't know. If you get into a shootout, do I feel good about, who the number 2 guy is over, a Walter Payton Award finalist in my opinion, if healthy? And I have to say no. I think that what he showed last year in the playoffs is that it didn't matter what the situation was. He was prepared to bring his team back. He was prepared to do whatever was necessary to bring his team back. They don't even use, in my opinion, his best asset, really, which is his legs. This dude is a track star out there playing quarterback, and they rarely ever even run him. They only run him in crucial situations where they need to pick up something. Not like South Dakota State was running Gronowski last year, where it looked like he was one of the 3 running backs out there for him. So I think without that quarterback in tow, I can't necessarily put them as my number 2. I mean, my number 3 team, but I can't drop them any lower just out of respect. Now we're getting the top 2. Who's your number 2 team right here?
Yeah, that ties in nicely because I do have Sam Houston as my number 2 team. It's interesting what the playoff committee is going to do with Sam Houston, because I do think they will go undefeated. They decided to play only 2 non-conference games, and so they'll have 10 wins, 10-0, and compare that to maybe 10 or 11 Division One wins for other teams. We'll see if that comes back to bite them. But yeah, I mean Schmidt did come back this last week in their blowout win against Lamar. He looked good. I mean, he threw a couple of picks, I guess. So maybe that's just, it was his first game back in a couple of weeks. So maybe shaking off a little bit of rust. But he's usually been pretty decent at taking care of the ball. And so we'll see, kind of how he responds to throwing a couple of interceptions. But I mean, with Sam Houston, so they're the defending champs, obviously. They have every piece coming back from last year. And so it's a matter of, does the playoff committee give them the benefit of the doubt because of their poor strength of their schedule, or do they punish them and maybe move in Eastern Washington or an undefeated North Dakota State or Villanova or Southern Illinois over Sam Houston because of the amount of ranked wins those teams have compared to Sam Houston, who might have 1 or 2 ranked wins.
You could argue that they punished Sam Houston last year for that. I mean, during the spring for that. They were the only undefeated team, and they ended up not being the number 1 seed going in, or at least the only, in my opinion, impressive undefeated team, and ended up, going in as not a number 1 seed. I think that might play into the minds of the committee as well. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, that's an excellent point. And I think Sam Houston in the spring play, because they were punished kind of on their bad strength of schedule in the spring, but they're also, I think, kind of punished just because of past precedent, because year after year, history tends to repeat itself in the FCS playoffs, where whether you're an undefeated Southland team or an undefeated OVC team, you usually don't fare well in the playoffs. And Sam Houston shifted that narrative. They beat James Madison. They beat South Dakota State. They beat North Dakota State as well in the quarterfinals. And so they kind of shifted that narrative around them. And I know a lot of people, especially in my mentions, say you can only look at this year in a singular focus. You can't look what happened in the past. And I disagree to a certain extent. I think you should put the most stock in what happens this year, but you shouldn't turn a blind eye to what happened in the past. Because with Sam Houston, people will say, well, a lot of people are telling me, how do we know Sam Houston is good? How do we know they're good? They don't play anyone this year. And I think you can look at the spring season and say, okay, we do know their defense is good because they showed it against North Dakota State. What's changed since the spring? Not a whole lot. We know their quarterback and Jaquez Ezzard and, Ramon Jefferson in their offensive line. We know they're good because they showed it in the spring. And so again, I think they deserve the benefit of the doubt a little bit, even with the bad strength of schedule. I don't know if they will get a top 2 seed, especially if like a North Dakota State wins out or some of those other teams wins out. But I do think the committee, I just get a sense that they will give them the benefits of the doubt and give them a top 2 seed if they do run the table. But honestly, it's 50-50 to me. It could go either way with Sam Houston.
Absolutely, and I agree. I think that there's a part of them that just lumps Sam Houston in with the Southland as a whole. I don't necessarily believe that's fair, because if you've looked at how they fared in the in the playoffs, they made a couple runs. They just have not been able to get over the hump versus some of those top tier teams at the at that semifinal level. But they had it rolling even before Casey Keller got there. They were still pushing for national titles. I think Keller came in, shifted the focus from being totally just an offensive team to caring more about defense, and that was what was able to kind of get them over the hump. But it still stands to reason that they've been kind of just lumped in with the thought or the stigma of the Southland in general. My number 2 team, obviously we're flipping 2s, North Dakota State. I think that if they do in fact run the table, it won't be enough in order to jump who we all know is will probably be the number 1 if things play out the way they've played out. Because they won't have as impressive wins overall. But I think that whenever you play in the Missouri Valley, if you go undefeated, you're getting a top two. You're getting a top two seed. It's just too deep of a conference. The amount of teams from the Valley that are going to be in the playoffs tell you that whomever's at the top of that of that conference is deserving of a top tier seed. And really and truly, you have to put it in some kind of way, because you have to have a way to kind of get these teams kind of off. And so North Dakota State standing there, I think if you ask me today, North Dakota State versus South Dakota State, I'm picking North Dakota State. If you ask me today, Jacks fans, forgive me. I know y'all say I pick against you all the time, but I really don't. I pick you most of the time, except when it's the team that I think is going to beat you. And so I think today, if you ask me, North Dakota State gets it done. I don't think anyone else is going to be able to knock them off. We'll see. You say that, sometimes every year, and then some team comes along and, pulls a Texas A&M on you. So we'll see how that goes. But I think North Dakota State, if everything stays as is aligning themselves for a 1 or 2 seed. I think that probably ends up being a 2 seed. So who's your number one?
Yeah, Eastern Washington is my number 1 seed, projected 1 seed. I think they have the best resume right now. Even they do have a non-counter win, and so we'll see if maybe they get punished for that, or maybe a different team gets the slight edge, just because if let's say North Dakota State runs the table, Eastern Washington runs the table. Well, you have North Dakota State with the 11 Division I wins, but then you have Eastern Washington with 10 Division I wins because of the non-counter. But then also Eastern Washington has an FBS win, North Dakota State does not, and so we'll see situationally, what happens with just how many undefeated teams there are in the FCS. But right now, I do think Eastern Washington runs the table. They have the big win against Montana. They have the FBS win against UNLV. Should have 3 more wins probably against ranked teams, assuming they do win, because Weber State will probably be ranked. Montana State will probably be ranked when they play them in early November. Both of those games are at home, and Eastern Washington has like a 14, 15, 16 game home winning streak, something along there. And then they do go to UC Davis, which I thought was going to be a 50-50 game and potentially a high seed on the line. But then the Aggies last week, even with their star quarterback, Hunter Rodriguez, coming back, loses at Idaho State, giving Idaho State its first win of the season. And so maybe that road game won't be as tough for Eastern Washington. And so I think the Eagles, again, just like with Villanova, just like with SIU, they'll be favored to win out. It's just a matter of, do they have that letdown performance? But right now I see the Eagles winning out and having a really, really good resume that I think probably will triumph over an undefeated Sam Houston team for that number 1 seed.
Absolutely. And I think Eastern Washington is right now sitting in the catbird seat as my favorite for the number 1 seed. I actually think the UC Davis loss hurts Eastern Washington because it's a bad loss. There's no way of saying it. And shame on you, UC Davis, because I had you as my next week in my fictional road show that I had going, that you would be where I would be coming, and then you lost. And so now I've got to go somewhere else because you didn't get it done. But no, seriously, I think that when you look at it, Eastern Washington, the competition that they've had to go against already, can't say enough about the win versus Montana because of how good Montana's defense is and what they were able to do to that defense. If Montana doesn't lose again, that's an even more impressive win for Eastern Washington. So I think that can't be ignored. The UNLV win is what it is because it's an FBS. I don't really put too much stock in the win because it's UNLV. I do, however, put stock in the fact that players win games, and they have the best quarterback in the country. If you ask me, they had the best quarterback in the country last year, and for some reason they gave it to Cole Kelly. No offense against Cole Kelly, but Eric Berrier was the Walter Payton Award winner last year. He'll be the Walter Payton Award winner this year unless somebody loses their mind. I'm talking to you, Sam Herder.
Hey, I had Barry A as my number one last
I know
year
you
on my
did.
ballot.
I know you did. I'm just saying to all of the FCS award voters out here, let's get this thing right. We also, by the way, sidebar, I was talking to Emery about this. We really need the petition to get a defensive freshman of the year award. I think you have to split that award. There's no reason why all of these freshmen should be lumped into the same Jerry Rice award. It usually always ends up going to an offensive guy anyway. We need to have a standalone freshman defensive award. That's just my sidebar. But we need to start ringing the bell for that, because these young freshmen at the FCS level need to be recognized, if for no other reason, to hopefully keep them in the fold, so they don't just start jumping to FBS schools with this one-time free transfer that they have now. But also for Eastern Washington, I think what's going to be interesting is they not only have the best passer, but they have one of the best rushers in the country as well. And when you have a balanced attack like that, one of the tops in passing, one of the tops in rushing in the country, you have a defense that is good enough, not good, but good enough that offense can outscore you. It's going to be really hard for anybody to beat them. And then when you're looking at the end and you see the gaudy numbers this offense has put up, you see all of the awards they're going to garner on the offensive and defensive side from players that they have on their team. It's going to be hard to go against them if they go undefeated, and I see them going undefeated. So right now, Eastern Washington, the road is going to go through the red turf, which is actually scary, because if you got to go to that red turf to play them, and they haven't lost, since Moses parted the Red Sea. It's going to be difficult up there, especially when you think about the weather in Eastern Washington at that time. All things are going to favor, the Fighting Eagles. Not Fighting Eagles. What is it?
Just the Eagles.
Just the Eagles. It's because what's his name is the Fighting
Hawks is
Fighting
UND.
Hawks. Yeah, that's UND. I didn't want to mess it up. I always say Fighting Eagles and then Screaming Hawks, or Fighting Hawks and the Eagles. I hate mascots. My mascot when I was in college was the Wonder Boys. Shout out to Arkansas Tech University. It's the only mascot that's known as the Wonder Boys anywhere in the country. They're proud of that, and I'm like embarrassed by it. So who knows? Great talking. Before I get you out of here, I'm really interested in this. I believe Jackson State has the best defense in the FCS. I believe that. They don't play against the best competition in the FCS, but I believe they have the best defense in the FCS. They shut down a really good Alabama A&M offense, and they shut down a pretty darn good Louisiana Monroe offense that scores against FBS teams regularly. If Jackson State was able to play in the FCS tournament, where would you see them?
I don't think they would get a seed, honestly. I think they would end up having to play in the first round as an unseeded team, just because I think if they were to play in the playoffs, that means they would be the second place team in one of the SWAC divisions, which means they'd technically be the third best team in the SWAC, because obviously the SWAC, the two division champs play in the championship game, and then that winner plays the MEAC champion in the Celebration Bowl. And so if a SWAC team was to make the playoffs, that would mean they wouldn't play in the SWAC championship game, which means they'd be the third best team in the SWAC. In the SWAC, as far as where they stand in the FCS power rankings for conferences, much better than it has been in the past. I guess I don't know where they're not top three. I don't think they would be above the CAA, the Valley, or the Big Sky. And so the third place team in the fourth, fifth, sixth best conference, I don't think would be worthy of a seed. And so I guess I wouldn't see Jackson State if they were to make the playoffs.
Let me change the dynamic for you, because I think I understand what you're saying, but I'm saying if this ridiculous thing wasn't in place, where the SWAC and the MEAC have agreed to essentially throw away their best teams to go into the FCS in lieu of this ridiculous HBCU national championship weird game that they came up with for, pennies on the dollar of what they really should have gotten for a game like that. if you were able to just take the best team in the SWAC, which Jackson State will be because they're number one right now, and I don't see them losing to any of them other teams unless they just have a awful game. Where would you seed them, or would they get a seed for you at that point? Or are you saying even if they're whatever they'll be, I think 10 or 11-1 because they lost to ULM in a really close game. Do you think they still wouldn't be worthy of a top 8 seed?
So hypothetically, if they're the best team in the SWAC got an auto bid into the playoffs and Jackson State finished 10-1, I think they would be very much on the verge of getting a seed. I don't know if they would end up getting a seed. I think they would be unseeded and have to play in the first rounds and then, play whoever regionally, then face a seeded team. Just because, again, past precedents won't help them. The HBCUs, historically, when they were in the playoffs, they did not fare very well. North Carolina A&T has been the HBCU powerhouse. They're now in the Big South, and they're not honestly competing all that well against a different looking schedule. And I know, I'm not saying Jackson State would get punished because of what NC A&T is doing. I'm just saying, in the minds of the playoff committee, in this hypothetical scenario, they might say, okay, Jackson State is 10-1, but who did they beat? What's their strength of schedule? How many ranked teams did they beat? Is a 10-1 Jackson State team going to be seeded over a 9-2 Montana State team that lost to Montana and Wyoming? Probably not. And so I don't think they would be seeded. I will say I would love to see them in the playoffs because I do think they do have one of the better defenses in the FCS. And I think the offense is good. And this is a young team. They're pretty young. And so 3 years from now, I don't know. We'll see. Maybe Coach Sanders will start pushing to make the playoffs. What would honestly be really funny, I don't know if it'd be funny, but if they declined, if Jackson State declined to play in the SWAC championship game and say, we would like to play in the playoffs, please give us an at-large bid. I think that would piss off a lot of people in the HBCUs. It would probably end up costing the school money because they get some of that Celebration Bowl payout. And so they probably wouldn't do that. But if he pushed for that, to say, hey, we think we're one of the best teams in the FCS, we want to prove it, that would be interesting. I doubt that happens, but it'd be interesting.
I tell you what, if this was the spring and the SWAC had their automatic bid lined up to be able to go into the playoffs, and you did not put Jackson State in as a top 8 seed, then whomever they played in those top 8 seeds in that next round would be pissed. Trust me, because nobody wants to see that defense. Nobody wants to see that defense. Even the teams who say they want to see that defense, they do not want to see that. I found it very interesting how much more physical and athletic they look than Louisiana Monroe. Understanding that Louisiana Monroe was putting up points on I want to say, didn't they blow out Troy or something like that? Or they were putting up points on legitimate group of 5 teams that when they had their quarterback, because Jackson State had them when they were going up against Rodriguez, and they really made them look like they should drop down back to an FCS team again. And I was like, wow, this defense is really, really good. And you can see the offense starting to come along, but I would love to see that defense have an opportunity to go up against some of those, other teams. I also said, the precedent of them not doing well in the playoffs, it's kind of skewed because they normally end up playing a really good team in the first round. That doesn't normally, bode well when you put them as one of the final seeds in the to make the tournament over behind teams that are usually just a 1-and-out team. Holy Cross will get a higher seed than they will in a lot of cases. Back when Holy Cross wasn't very good at all, but just was the best team in the Patriot League at that time. So it'll be interesting. That's an interesting conversation. Maybe one that we can dig into another day. Sam Herder, Hero Sports, BetMGM, the FCS Football Talk podcast. You can follow him at Sam Herder FCS on Twitter. And anything else you want to plug while you're here?
No, I think you nailed it, man. I
Awesome.
appreciate all the plugs, and I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely. We'll definitely have to do this again. This is fun.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds great with me.
Absolutely. And again, you can find me everywhere that you find anybody anywhere at Gene Clemens. Make sure that you like and subscribe to the channel, Coach Gene Clemens. We are getting closer to 2,000. We really do appreciate all of you hanging out with us. Check me out soon. You know where to find my stuff. Until next time, peace.